What role do you think race is playing in what's driving the situation we're living through right now?
Oh, it's critical. And by race, we're really talking about racism, because racism in America is the most powerful political organizing tool that we have ever had. White supremacy and racism. And what we are seeing with Donald Trump is that he has been able to tap into racism and use it as an organizing and political mobilizing device. And we ought not be surprised that it's actually effective, right? Because it is cheap and it plays into everything that we have been feeding the larger white society about the problems that this nation has faced. And so he's tapping into that in everything that he does, both subtly and overtly. And so it's not really a surprise that he's being successful. So I was one of the folk, who were looking at this election during the run-up, and my students were saying they're from Ohio, they're from rural Ohio. Most of my students are white, and they were like, "Dr. Jeffries, what's going to happen in this election?" And I was like, "Oh, Hillary Clinton's going to win. This is 2016." Yeah. And they're like, "Oh, okay, why?" I was like, "Oh, people aren't going to. There's a fool, there's a buffoon, there's all this other stuff." And as we're getting closer to the election, they're having these conversations and they're asking me, "What's going to happen?" Hillary Clinton's going to win. And they're like, my family back home in rural Ohio, in the suburbs of Ohio, they're like all on this Trump train, right? I'm like, look, who has the PhD? I'm telling you what's going to happen, right? Like, what do y'all know? And of course, I was wrong. They were right. And the reason why they were right, they were closer to the people in that instance, right? Yeah. And I was in my bubble and just not believing. But what I underestimated two things. And this has everything to do with sort of the role of racism in American society and how it's used as a political tool. I underestimated the number of white people who would be animated and mobilized by Trump's white supremacy. I underestimated what that number would be. Now, that's still not the majority. That's still a small segment of that percentage of the voting population, but it was more than I estimated. Mm-hmm. But I also underestimated the number of white people who would be okay with Trump's white supremacy and cause racism, right? Now, that's the bigger group. Now, I underestimated the size of that. I thought surely all this silliness, all this racism, all this vitriol, all this sexism and xenophobia, like there will be people like, nah, we can't go for that. But I underestimated how many of them were willing to abide by that so that they could have their tax cut, so that they could pretend to be concerned about the right to life and all these other things. I underestimated that. And that speaks to the power of racism as a political organizing tool.
Well, and you tapped into something, it's real. And, it's fun time. Sometimes, I wrestle with this. I genuinely wrestle with this. When Barack Obama got elected, it's not that I thought we were post-racism or post-racial.
Yeah.
But I did think that we had taken a step along a pathway that said, you can't be overtly racist anymore in America and be successful. There's a subtle racism that exists. There's a personal kind of exclusion. People live lives that were exclusive, that didn't have racial interaction. All that was true. People made individual decisions. But like you, I think I underestimated how much people were willing to take public stances that were a great personal risk to the very enterprise of American democracy, and go along with such an overtly racist appeal.
Yeah. I think, and maybe I'm with you. I was in the same place, right? Like, we're not post-racial, but this is a step forward, and we are in a different place. And I still think that is true, right? To elect an African American to the presidency, we are in a different place. That wasn't going to happen 5 years, 10 years, 20 years before. So that aspect is true. I think how much of it reflected a substantial change in the thinking of white people, that's what didn't change, right? So that's where we didn't move as far. And I also think, and I'm thinking about this now in the moment, and I think time will tell the moment that we're in, what we're seeing in the streets, but then also this next election is really going to be telling, right? Because there's no guarantee. I still don't know what's going to happen, right? But you have seen the way in which democracy and the fundamental basics of democracy have been threatened and are being undermined. the rule of law in the streets, but then also in the courtroom. When you look at what he has Attorney General Barr doing,
right?
You know, you can put blinders on and say, well, you know, I knew he was unorthodox. I knew he was racist. I knew he was sexist. I knew he was xenophobic. But
Hillary Clinton was imperfect. Hillary Clinton was an imperfect candidate, right?
I get it, right? And so I didn't like her, and you know, I was okay. You know, I didn't like that stuff, but you know, it is what it is. I didn't want Hillary Clinton, whatever the reason. But no one would have said then, or no one can say now, looking back at the last 4 years, that he is not a threat to democracy. And so the assessment now is, you know, that what, you know, this isn't just sort of, you know, an actor and no harm could be done, right? Because that's part of it too, right? Well, nothing will come of it, right? We need to disrupt things. You're moving from just disrupting and, you know, draining the swamp, which obviously never was going to happen. You move from that to destroying the very nature of the nation in which we live. Now, there will be some who will go along with that. He's still going to get 45, 50 million votes, right? I mean, it's not. So what are they voting for? Now, you're still going to have a large segment of the white population. These are all going to be white people who still see that democracy, and this is actually very American, they're okay with democracy for themselves, right? So we're okay living in a world in which these people don't have basic rights, but we do, right? And that's actually the longer American tradition. So what we're saying and advocating is like, no, we want something different than what has been fundamentally American, which is this limited democracy for some. You got white folk who are like, nah, we're totally fine. You can limit the rights. We're willing to sacrifice rights. They're just not our rights, right? We're willing to sacrifice the rights of other people. We don't see our rights being taken away because this white supremacist is on our side.
Or the question is, this is the more treacherous, damning question. Are they willing to sacrifice their own individual rights in order to keep Black people, women, others from having full citizenship? We'll see. And be willing to go along with a more authoritarian state where democracy has been sacrificed in order to maintain an order that they think is the right one?
See, I think that question has been asked and answered in the sense, if we go back to 9/11, right? The willingness to give up certain rights to the police state in terms of invasiveness and wiretapping and investigation to preserve the nation, right? But it's a will, again, even that is read as, I'm not giving up my rights, right? Like, I'm not worried that the police are going to come into my mosque because I don't go to a mosque. And why do we have a mosque anyway, right? So I think there's some calculation in there in terms of the imagination of these white voters that surrendering these rights or being asked to or seeing it happen, like somehow that doesn't apply to me, right? And as long as that's the other, well, hey, I'm okay with it. Like the police aren't going to march on me like that, right? Like, because I see myself, I think in the end it comes down to, and now we're talking about guns and the military in the street. I think in the end it will come down to which side of the barrel of that gun do you see yourself standing? And how they answer that question will tell you a lot about how they understand democracy in this nation. Now, people of color have always seen themselves standing facing that barrel. Now you see more and more of these white kids out there, and they facing the front of that barrel too. But when you head up into rural Virginia, when you head into these suburbs, how many of them are going to see themselves facing that barrel or standing behind that line of the military and the police? And I think in the end, that's going to determine really the fate of the democracy as we know it today and the future of it, where it goes.
We have perhaps the worst possible person to sit in the Oval Office today that we've had maybe in 100 and some odd years. Well, is that fair?
It is fair. That's an accurate assessment. I think history, of course, will be the judge of the present. And I think will also be the judge of the president. and he will not fare well in time. He's not faring well now. The only thing that's sort of keeping him boosted, if you will, are those who are sort of bending the knee out of for political purposes. But beyond that, even any objective scholar will look at this and say, this is a disaster of a presidency. And I think one of the big lessons and takeaways from this administration, looking back at it, is a lesson on American history and the absence of formal guardrails to constrain an out of control presidency, out of control executive. In the past, we have always relied upon either party, patriotism, or principle to govern the actions of those who might be otherwise ungovernable. And in this case, the president is neither governed by party nor principle and has no patriotism. You let 100,000 people die. I mean, it's a false flag stuff. And so what do we do then? And I think what has been revealed is we actually need some formal guardrails, because those informal guardrails just simply don't apply because the person in the executive doesn't care.
Yeah, you actually have somebody who takes our desire for normalcy, our desire for a more genteel way of doing business, and uses it against the system to get his way. So for instance, everybody knows the president speaks, news media feel an obligation to cover what the president says. So the president, knowing that that is the way that the news media approach it, says things that are verifiably untrue just to get the media to cover them and to push that out into the public diet of information. I mean, it's a pretty, it would be impressive if it wasn't so destructive.
The idea of using the media to amplify, even when he knows it's not true. And again, it's the principle, right? So that's the principle. There's this principle like, well, I don't want to, at least I may lie, but I don't want to be caught in a lie. Like, he don't care, right?
Right, exactly.
Know that out. You know, people, all politicians lie. Well, you know, some lie more than others. Some fudge the truth, but none of them want to be caught in a lie until now, where it doesn't matter. So what do you do when it doesn't matter? That's when we start sort of descending into these real problematic areas, because what won't he do?
All right, so let me talk to you about the historical context here, because you're an expert in this aspect of it. Has there been, I mean, again, as you said, we will judge, history is being written, we will see in the past, but has there been a more treacherous period in the American enterprise than this one, other than the years leading up to the Civil War?
Yeah, no. This is it. I mean, that's literally what we're talking about. In other words, you can make an argument. I mean, it's clearly the years leading up to the Civil War and the Civil War, the nation was on the brink of total collapse. I mean, it had fractured. It had literally fractured. But there were still remnants of the democracy, at least in half of the nation, right? Now, look, anything, it's complicated because we've never had this sort of pure form of everyone has their rights. So it's always been, you know, some are in, more are out. So that we take that for granted, right? Like, that's in there, that's baked in. But we're talking about moments when the nation itself may dissolve. And there's really only the one major moment, the Civil War. There was the possibility during the Depression, if you kept Hoover in, or FDR didn't move in the direction that he was moving, if you didn't have him at that moment, he was the right person for the time, then you do not know how this nation may have unraveled. I think what we are seeing now, and what we saw during the Civil War, and even during the New Deal era during the Depression, is the fragility of democracy, because we do not have a lot of hard and fast rules to govern the society. In other words, we're looking at the executive and all the things that he can do, and people are like, well, why can't we stop him? Because there's no law that says we can, right? We were so dependent on this person not acting like a dictator for those principle, patriotism, and party. And so when that's out, who knows what may happen? And we are seeing, and this is the first time we've had a president of this sort, we are seeing that how quickly you can unravel the democratic norms that have sustained the society, even though we know not everyone has been able to benefit from them. But even with the majority able to benefit, when that spiral begins to pick up momentum, things can go awry very quickly. To maintain a democracy, you have to have buy-in from not only the people, but the leadership. If you don't have buy-in from the leadership, then the people are at a loss.